Hello and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. Today's guest grew up inside a story. Her childhood was nomadic, imaginative, often chaotic, and it became the bedrock of her first novel, Hideous Kinky, later adapted into a film starring Kate Winslet. Since then, she's written 9 more books, each peeling back the layers of love, identity and family with grace and precision. Her latest, My Sister and Other Lovers, centres on 2 sisters navigating secrets, heartbreak and the long shadows cast by childhood. It's a book about what we inherit, what we deny, and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. Esther Freud, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thanks so much. I loved your introduction, and I must write that down when people ask me what the book's about. Just later, I will make a note.
We're sitting here in your lovely home, in your family home, where it just feels so settled, domestic, loved and stable. It couldn't be more different from your own childhood.
Well, that's not entirely true, because my mother had an incredible knack of making a home beautiful and settled very quickly. I remember when we first moved to London, and I've written about this a little bit in my second novel, Peerless Flats, we were in a sort of temporary council flat, and she linoed the floor, painted the walls, and reupholstered an old sofa that she'd found on a skip. And we were only there for a year. Not that we even thought we would be there for that long. She was extraordinarily inspiring in her ability to seize the moment. And I'm not saying I have any of those skills, but it's not as if we were ever living in an atmosphere that wasn't quite peaceful and quite homey.
I wonder if you could summon perhaps a single moment from the travelling part of your childhood that still clings to you.
Oh, a single moment. It's actually very hard to choose a single moment, because even as I was saying, making my last comment, suddenly memories flooding in of actually I suddenly remembered living in a completely derelict house where I seized a sort of wire that was sticking out of the wall for no reason, was thrown across the room because it was still electric. I guess I feel lucky that when I remember things, they tend to be the really lovely things. Those are the things that I wonder, I'm so interested in this. My mind goes to the positive, and some people, many of whom I love deeply, their mind, just for whatever, goes to the more traumatic and the darker. And in a way, it's what my book's about. The 2 sisters who have grown up together, incredibly closely entwined, but they had an almost unrecognizable childhood from each other because of the way they remember it and because of the way they experienced it.
I completely relate to that, being the subject of a memoir about our mother. My brother and I had completely separate childhoods, really, so I completely see exactly what you're getting at. And I think it's true of almost every family, isn't it?
I read your brother Peter Godwin's memoir, which I really loved, and I was really struck by that, actually, how he describes the family life, but always with the idea and the understanding that these 3 children in the family, who were born quite far apart, had completely different experiences. And I feel it's really the source of real interest and quite fascination for me.
Now, you didn't read till you were 10, which is extraordinary. I wonder how that now, as a writer, has gone on to affect your sense of language. Did stories feel magical, or were they maddeningly out of reach?
They were very magical and incredibly important. And I think it's why when I've written about me and my sister's close relationship, I've often used words, chants, rhymes, songs, because language was so important. And my first memories really were from Morocco, where we moved to when I was 4, nearly 5. And the memories I have before then are pretty sketchy. And we had a lot of games that we played, all involving words. Words were all we had. And the fact that we were living in a country where people spoke Arabic and French, and very few people spoke English. And so I created kind of strange songs and kind of magical stories made up of all sorts of words that I didn't entirely understand. And then we created this sort of special code for if anything was particularly amusing, strange, or confusing, we would say hideous, kinky to each other, not really knowing what these words meant, but feeling that they somehow summed it up. Yeah. And I didn't ever think I would call my novel that, but when I finished writing it, it seemed suddenly to be the only title.
And of course, the other words you play with are from a song. Could you give us a little rendition of I Don't Know How to Hate You?
So people listening to this programme will hopefully be of the generation that listened to Mary Magdalene in Jesus Christ Superstar singing passionately about her great love for Jesus. I don't know how to love him. And actually, funnily enough, I never saw this West End show, but my sister did, and she came back and possibly with the album, and so much in the 70s was secondhand. I often knew the lyrics to an entire album before I'd ever heard it, because everything was sort of spoken, especially in the community I grew up in, where we had very little access and never had a TV or listened to the radio or anything. So we would sing to each other regularly with great relish. I don't know how to hate her. She makes me sick and she makes me spew. She's the worst. She's just the worst. And on it went.
So you're the daughter of Bernardine Coverley and Lucian Freud, the painter. Your great-grandfather was Sigmund Freud, your uncle was Clement Freud, your sister is Bella Freud. Did that lineage feel like a gift or a weight?
I was magically, marvellously unaware of any lineage. I grew up, as you've said, in this sort of peripatetic manner with my mother. And when we saw our father, he never mentioned anything about his family. We didn't know any of his family. In fact, I was thinking the other day how extraordinary it was that when me and my sister were born, neither of the four grandparents knew of our existence. My father's parents never knew of our existence. And my mother's parents, it took a few years for them to catch on.
I mean, you were spotted on the street by a friend of theirs.
Yes, a relative apparently saw us waiting at a bus stop and said, "Oh, I didn't know your daughter was married," knowing full well what she was actually saying. This was the mid-60s by now. And we didn't meet our mother's parents for some years. But then, of course, once we did, all those prejudices were dropped and they were absolutely doting.
They were Catholic. The Freud side of the family is Jewish. You identify as Jewish?
I do. Probably, maybe it's a funny thing, the whole Jewish race, isn't it? Because, of course, I can identify as Jewish because I have Jewish blood, whereas Catholic is a religion that was taken on or dropped. And so I probably identify as sort of being half Jewish and half Irish, which I feel extraordinarily lucky to have these two interesting kind of bloodlines that both have a lot of creativity in them.
And you and Bella, what kind of sisters were you? Would you call yourself co-conspirators or competitors?
Well, I would say we would, I'm talking for myself. I would identify as a co-conspirator, but secretly I was probably much more, and still am, more competitive than I would ever let on. So I very happily adopted the role of younger sister. We were born, our characters suited our birth order. Bella is much more sort of forthright and sort of maybe more fierce in her determination in life. And I was always much more watchful, but underneath, subtly determined, really, ultimately, to get what I needed and wanted. And so we were sort of playing roles, but it did work very well. And we were certainly a little gang. And but the difficulties that I wanted to explore in this book, and I think this is the case so often, is where the loyalties lie in the wider family. So we were a gang, but in order to be close, who was on the outside? And so sometimes I was close with my mother, and there was Bella on the outside. Sometimes I was close with Bella, and there was my mother on the outside. So I wanted to, there's a wonderful quote from a writer, never be afraid of exaggerating in the direction of the truth. So I took this truth, and the novel really hinges on the often very difficult and painful relationship between this triangle of closely aligned females.
Because, of course, Lucy just wants Bea and her mother to get on. She's also a quiet, eccentric child. And I wonder, because obviously this is based on your own childhood, I wonder then why for you ended up at drama school. Was it a way to disappear or perhaps to finally be seen?
It seems so unlikely and incongruous. I decided, well, right as far back as I can remember, I had to have a plan about my future. And I was amazed at the confidence of others just going forward into life without a plan. I remember thinking that would be quite scary. So I always had a plan, and it was often something non-academic, not that I understood that. But, I wanted to be an acrobat, a tightrope walker, a farmer. These were the kind of things that I was looking to make a career out of. I went to see a play when I was about 12, and the sight of this family, this community standing on the stage as everyone applauded, holding hands and sort of bowing their heads, I just thought, I want to be with them. I want to be making that story come alive on the stage and then going off and travelling somewhere. It seemed utterly marvellous, and I decided there and then that I would be an actress. And I stuck to it. And it kept me very safe. So then I knew what I was going to do. I wanted to leave school. 16, I moved to London. I enrolled in a drama course, and I went to drama school. And I don't know if I wanted to disappear, but I certainly didn't want to be visible myself. I just wanted to be part of a group, and I wanted to tell stories.
So how did telling stories through your acting then transfer into telling stories as a writer?
I think drama school is actually an incredibly useful training for almost anything that you might do later in life. In a funny way, it makes you quite humble, and it makes you extraordinarily used to rejection. So other writers I know who sent books off and was rejected, they put them in a drawer. When I sent my first novel off and I had various rejection slips, I just kept sending it because obviously rejection was part of my life. I didn't even take it very seriously. That was very useful. But one of the things that really appealed to me about Drama Centre, which was the drama school that I went to, was that you were encouraged to create characters and scenes that you wrote yourself. I'd heard about that, and it was the place I most wanted to go. I was ecstatic when I got a place there. And so while I was there, I started to write, and it was the first time that I'd ever really done any creative writing. They asked us to write little biographies of our characters as if they were autobiographies, and I loved doing that, probably more than playing the part. And once I left, I started going to creative writing classes. I started writing songs and poems, and I started working with a fellow student, Kitty Aldridge, who's also a novelist herself now, and we put on a show together. We took a show to Edinburgh, and we put on a show in a little theatre just off the West End, and we had so much fun doing this. I think happily I would have gone on doing that forever. It felt like this is what I want to do. She had other plans and went off to act in films and do other things. And so that was when I was forced to consider the horrifying idea that I would sit alone and write. And it was the last thing I wanted to do. It's so scary. I can't imagine anyone really wanting to do that, especially sort of mid-20s. And I thought, God, if only I had a story to tell, maybe that's what I could do to sort of keep myself safe again from this endless life of one play ending and having to find work all the time. And then I thought, well, I do have a story. What about in Morocco? When I was a kid at school, I was always telling people little stories about Morocco, and they're pretty uninterested. And so I started to write my first book, and within the year it took to write, really felt as if my life changed, because I, instead of walking down the street feeling rather ashamed that I was an out-of-work actress, I felt rather proud that I was secretly writing a novel, and no one knew any different about me.
That's extraordinary. Of course, as we know, it was then made into a film. When it came out and your childhood was on a cinema screen, I wonder how that sat with you, but possibly more importantly, how it sat with the rest of your family. I mean, you've said in the past that writing some of your books felt like throwing a bomb into your family. So what do you owe the people you write about?
When I wrote that novel, I think I wrote it as if it was sort of unfolding again in front of my eyes without really much thought for consequences or really even entirely believing it. I fantasized that it would be published, but I didn't really believe it would be. I sometimes fantasized it would be a film. It was really only when the reviews started to come out that I realized what I'd done to my poor family. And I did feel incredibly responsible. I was very lucky. My parents, as described earlier, were extremely individual and quite rebellious people themselves. They'd lived the life that they'd wanted to live quite individually. And therefore, they weren't critical of me doing exactly the same. It was just hard for my mother particularly to have her character assassinated in a way I honestly don't think would happen now. The amount of people who've read Hideous Kinky and said how it inspired them to take their children with them when they went travelling to live a freer life. But the people who reviewed it, which is often at that time middle-aged men, were sort of using descriptions of dragging the children around Marrakesh, feckless, hopeless, etc. And that was, even though it's a novel, it was also always described as, based in Esther Freud's own life. It was hard for my mother. She felt very unfairly attacked.
And of course, that's something you address in this latest book, and you talk about her reaction to this very sort of meta concept that B has made this film called Hideous Kinky, and she's the mother character is very worried about how she's going to be portrayed. I thought it was a lovely twist to make the real film into the fictional B's work.
I know. I actually didn't. I changed their names when I was writing this book from B and Lucy because I wanted to give myself the freedom to take them on whatever journey and not stick to the kind of narrative and chronology of our own lives. And that gave me so much more to play with. And I wrote that section quite late on. I thought it was such an interesting and difficult time. It would be really interesting to examine. And also I was looking for a way of showing how the sisters' relationship sort of ebbs and flows, and they've been quite estranged until that point for some of the book. And that's what bonds them together, the success that they start to have. And then suddenly the mother is on the outside, being so furious with them both that they bond again together. And then later we see them. Well, there's an interesting moment for me to sort of look at. I mean, I really enjoyed trying to play with this theme, is that Lucy, who's always either been close to the mother or the sister, suddenly the mother and the sister have a moment where they're together and she sees them on the other side of the door and she's on the other side and she thinks, oh, I thought I always wanted more than anything in the world for them to get on. I wonder if, and then she starts to wonder, is that really what she wants?
There's a lot about writing about the comfort of being welcomed into other people's homes. The Mitchells in Sussex, a kind of borrowed family. We arrive at Craigmont later, this grand but decaying estate. It's owned by the Calhoun family. Ted Calhoun becomes one of the most moving and tragic figures in the book, and that the house itself is almost a character. It becomes sort of soaked in class tension and history and loss. I wonder if, were you writing about the ghosts we carry into even the most beautiful places? It just was a very powerful part for me.
Yes, I think I was writing about that great desire that so many of us have to find an alternative family. And I love novels about adopted families. There are so many fantastic novels, aren't there, from the point of view of an outsider of a big family. So I was really drawn to that. And I think later Lucy says that she's always looked for a family, and in a way becoming an actress is a way of looking for a family. And then when she does meet the man that becomes her husband and they have their own family, it's just so incredibly important to her to hold on to that until it is almost impossible for her to pretend that is actually a family that suits her in any way. So I suppose I was sort of trying to thread that idea through the book.
And the book is full of men, the other lovers. There's Danny, there's Ted, there's Clive, there's Lex, each and others, Laurie. Each one is tender, they're flawed or perhaps half present. I wondered if you were writing about desire or disappointment or both?
Well, I think at first, because this book started as a book of short stories, first I was just having fun. I was just taking a moment that I thought would be interesting to explore, something I'd been thinking about, something I've written about before, or something that had happened in my own life, and kind of making a world around it. And the stories were originally called Desire, after the first chapter, which is based around Bob Dylan's album Desire, which the family listened to on a hitchhiking trip round Ireland. And then all the stories had names of songs or albums. And when it was finished, I thought Desire and Other Stories, it's not really quite holding together. Like it could, I just didn't ever want to put a book out that didn't feel as if it was substantial. It felt light and inconclusive. And all the lovers were sort of a bit similar and a little bit too different. It was funny how it didn't quite work. And then I thought, what's this book really about? And I thought, well, it's not really about desire. It's about love. And I suppose it could be about sisters if I took those sister threads that popped up through it and actually pulled that thread tight. And so at that point, sort of nearly 2 years into the writing of this book, I started again, but using all the material that I could and trying to link everything together and pull it tighter and tighter. And it took a long time to really come together. There were moments where I really despaired that it would ever work because I wasn't sure what I was doing. And I was finding that out as I went along. So the other lovers are there to show that if your beginnings have been maybe lacking in any kind of emotional concrete foundations, it's very hard to continue on to make a foundation. You tend to be attracted mostly to people who are unavailable, as Lucy is. And she realizes at one point that there's a correlation between the more likely someone is to leave her, the more she likes them. But at the same time, she's also looking desperately for a family. So she's really struggling with that. And B also chooses people who are completely unavailable. And so they struggle with this and as a result need each other in the way only sisters can when their love lives are full of drama.
And laughter too. It's a funny book in lots of places. You talk about pulling the threads and the whole sort of art of writing. And of course you've taught it. You've taught at Faber. You've also taught on the wonderful Silk Road Slippers residential course in Morocco, which must have been amazing for your students to have you there in that place. And so what you're doing here, as you've started to describe, is actually incredibly complex, building this novel. It's not just sitting down in the white heat of creation, is it?
No, I mean, if I had have known what I wanted to do, I could have written this novel fairly easily. It would have been a different novel, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. Sometimes you have to write yourself right inside the sort of furnace to discover what's there. And when I am teaching and people are struggling to decide on which story to write or what to do, and they're not starting, they're thinking, I would say less thinking, more doing. Just write. You might write for years, but you will eventually come to what you want to write. And I know that's a luxury to have the time and the patience to do that. But it is, for me, so much more powerful than waiting for the perfect story to come. And it's happened to me a few times where I thought, God, I could have just been lying down for 2 years. Now I know what I'm doing. But actually, probably I wouldn't have found out without going down all these sort of dead ends.
There's a really powerful section on therapy, particularly around transference. And I wonder what you wanted to explore in that relationship.
Well, what I really was exploring was Lucy, I suppose, is always hoping that love is going to save her. And she bounces from one relationship to another. And when her marriage is in trouble and she goes to see a therapist, lo and behold, she finds herself falling in love with the therapist, also thinking that maybe he's the man for her. Maybe this is the answer. And I wanted the reader to be unsure whether this was a really helpful relationship that was going to lead her to some liberation, or whether yet again she was being manipulated by a vain and powerful man. And I leave that. I think everyone will have their own opinions about that.
I absolutely loved it, and I was cheering her on, thinking, yes, you can do this. You can do this once a week for the rest of your life and be happy. But we mustn't give too many spoilers away. Lex is the person that she does eventually marry. He's an academic. He travels a huge amount. He's guarded. He's full of secrets. You were married to an actor, David Morrissey, who, of course, was also, I imagine, away a lot. And as an actor, somebody who's used to just, well, being somebody else. I wonder if there were similarities between Lex and David.
Well, I wanted to look at the whole idea that people are so often raised with, especially women, is that the man's work is so important that it must always come first. And obviously, being the daughter of an artist, their work is so important. It never even occurs to one that that doesn't come first. And then, so I felt that that's exactly the kind of man that Lucy would choose. Her father in the book is an inventor. He has to be always thinking desperately of something new, and he needs everything he needs to make that possible. And that doesn't involve a domestic life, that's for sure. And so she thinks that she's found someone very different, because he's settled, he's centred, he comes from a family where no one's been divorced. She thinks she's done really well. In fact, because B at that point is seeing a therapist who says we must make sure we don't repeat the patterns. And she thinks, nope, I'm not going to. But of course, you can't know everything. And she discovers that Lex's great passion is to work. And people keep saying, how's Lex? And she says, away. And they go, oh, he's doing so well, so marvellous. And she thinks, when are they going to think, away again? But he's very charismatic and everyone adores him, as she does. And it just takes an awful lot for her to free herself.
Both sisters express themselves through art, Bea in film, Lucy in textiles. Do you think that creativity is sometimes the only language that trauma can be told in?
Well, it's interesting because I know in the past I've written books where my character's struggling through all sorts of traumatic incidents. In the end, novels are made up of these things, unless you're writing comedy. And I haven't always given them a creative outlet. And I thought that's really unfair, because actually it is such a big part of someone often who has struggled, is that they find a way to release some of the tension and for it to feel really worth it, because you can draw on all this marvellous emotional resource that you have. Is it the only way? I think there are probably all sorts of ways. I think probably throwing yourself into work of whatever kind, maybe doctors, maybe lawyers, maybe there's all sorts of ways. It's just because almost everyone I know has some kind of creative job. I find it almost impossible to think of what people do who aren't making something. And sometimes people tell me about a job and I think, oh my God, how amazing. I had no idea that even existed. And I sort of often make little notes, possible jobs for future characters.
Do you think that we ever really make peace with our families, or do we just learn to live with the contradictions?
I think learning to live with the contradictions is a way of making peace, because you start to think, what are you trying to prove here by fighting against those contradictions? Am I just trying to be right about it? There is no right, really, in these situations. And it's a great release to just go, here we go again. I know this. It makes me feel crazy, but I'm just going to let it go. And remember, all the marvellous things about them, and just let go of the things that drive you completely crazy. It's just not worth it.
Lucy has a little girl, Pearl, and there's a terrible accident that happens. A really very, very moving part of the book, which tells us so much about her love and her relationship with her own child. And of course, in real life, you're a mother too, and now a grandmother. Do your own children read your books? And what do they think about your past? And is there any kind of sort of, I don't want to call it intergenerational trauma, but intergenerational memory that has come through to them?
Well, at first, my children, for quite a long time, my older two children weren't that engaged with any of my books and didn't read them. They saw the film of Hideous Kinky quite a long time ago. But it was my youngest child, who's 6 years younger than the other two. The age gap between the second one and the third is 6 years. And he's always been very interested. He's a very creative person himself. and a wonderful reader and a writer of songs. And he started to read the books more closely, and it kind of encouraged, I think, the others to read them. And we went out for dinner. He's just turned 21, and we went out for dinner a month or so ago. He just read a proof of this book, and he said, we'd been talking, and then he said, so, Mum, we haven't really spoken about your book. And we had the most incredibly illuminating conversation, just as you say, about the past, about things that I'd drawn upon, about real things that had happened that I haven't ever really discussed with him, that I felt maybe it was time to do. It opened up this incredible conversation. I was really grateful for that.
In the book, Lucy and Bee discover they have 3 half-brothers, and I just wonder about your own wider family, the other children of Lucian.
Yes, I mean, that was, I must say, something that I was quite compelled to write, because I don't think it's so very common to meet people later in life who are related to you, who feel so familiar, who you've never even known existed. And I've had that experience, I have to say, quite a few times. Until I was 13, I didn't meet any of my siblings, apart from my full sister, but I had 3 stepsisters and a half-brother. There was no room in my head or time to even consider that there were any more that were needed. And then I started to meet one after another, and slowly through those decades I met more. And it always is quite startling. Even if I see one of my half siblings who I hardly ever see, especially the boys, they remind me of my father in a way that actually jolts me. I feel the foundations of the earth are sort of shifted in some strange way, because they're him and not him. And so I wanted to write about an experience like that.
Mm-hmm. And how has the book landed with the wider family?
Well, my sister Bella was incredibly useful when I finished a full draft. She read it very, very closely. She really encouraged me to be very precise and fearless, and to cut out anything hazy or sentimental, and to just go sharp in there with what I wanted to say. And the book was much better for it. I have to be honest and say, wider family, it's only just been published, and it so far, no comment.
But fantastic comments from everybody else I speak to. I couldn't love this book more. So thank you so much for writing it and for talking to me. Esther Freud, My Sister and Other Lovers, is published by Bloomsbury. It's out now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Georgina.
You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks also to the production team of Steph Chungu and Elliot Greenfield. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.